Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on Cimpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Sanchali Pal. Previously, Sanchali worked on issues of sustainable development in the United States, East Africa, and South Asia at Dahlberg and Tesla. Sanchali holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA in economics from Princeton. Sanchali is the founder and CEO of Jaro, a new climate action app that allows you to track and improve your carbon footprint. Sanchali will share how Jaro works and how people-based solutions like Jaro can help individuals build sustainable habits and participate in collective climate action. Hey, Sanchali, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to talking about your app, but I want to check in first. Let's talk about COVID-19. How's that impacting you? What's going on there?
Well, like a lot of other people, at least in the US and around the world, we are at home here in California. I'm based in Oakland. So a lot of the last few months has been trying to figure out how to make remote work our reality. We also are dealing here in California with the wildfires over the last couple weeks. So it's been really devastating to see almost 1 million acres of forests burn over the last couple weeks, and trying to stay indoors and stay safe and stay engaged on climate from what we can do at home.
All right. So you've had a bit of an interesting career journey, and it got you here to Joro. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that story and how you started Joro.
Yeah, so I was one of probably many people who knew climate change was a problem, but it wasn't the primary focus of my career for a while. I initially studied economics. I worked in international development out of undergrad, worked first in the US and then moved to India and to East Africa, to Ethiopia, working on projects to help the government and companies improve quality of life for people in the developing world, worked on projects in agriculture, infrastructure development, economic growth. And what I really saw consistently throughout that work was how much energy and climate were underpinning all of the challenges that people, especially in developing countries, are facing, and that there would be no sustainable future for these countries with populations who wouldn't have access to clean energy or to a clean energy future. So I came back to the US to go to business school and really try to figure out how I could be useful in the energy fight, and the fight against climate change. I initially thought maybe that was by working at a company like Tesla, putting my analytical and technology skills to use, trying to figure out how we could decarbonize the transportation sector. But along the way, I started thinking a lot about equity and access. The ways that regular people could start taking climate action into their own hands. We need policy solutions, we need technology solutions, but there's a big gap in helping people engage and put pressure on our systems to move towards a lower carbon future. Part of my journey was watching the documentary Food Inc. and seeing and thinking about the fact that I do make choices every day about how I'm spending my money. And at the very least, I could be more intentional about those choices. And I wanted to focus on the things that mattered most. I don't necessarily want to focus on the things that, even if I do them for my whole lifetime, and even if I get 20 of my friends to do it, it will never make a difference. I want to focus on the things that are my biggest levers of change, that if I do it over the course of my lifetime or I do it with other people, it could really make a material difference in moving our systems. So food was one of the first ones that I really dove into in my research, and started realizing that there are places in our home, our energy, our transportation, and even the way we consume goods and services that if we make big intentional choices, we can make changes like 20 to 30 to 50% of our carbon footprint, and move the companies that serve us as well. So that's sort of where the beginning of Joro came from. And over the last year, we've been working on an actual mobile app that allows users to track their carbon footprint based on how they spend money. So you can connect your credit or debit cards if you choose, or you can manually add information to track your carbon footprint and find what are your biggest levers for change. We hope that this is sort of an education and action platform that helps people move towards more systemic ways to take action. The app came out officially in the App Store in April of this year for Earth Day, and we're working on building out more features.
All right, I want to talk a bit more about the app in a second here, but just more broadly, this focus on consumers, and so that's your point here. So like they have a role in addressing climate change, and so why is that your approach?
I think it's important to start with the fact that climate change is a systemic problem and to recognize that government and big companies have important roles to play, but also to recognize that systems are made up of people, and companies and governments don't change behavior unless consumers and citizens demand it. There have been very few, if any, situations in history in which companies and governments have created social change before people have demanded it. So recognizing the power of consumers, of individuals, when we band together as a collective to shift systems. I think it's an area that is very unsexy. Many people don't want to look at it. People are excited about new technologies and carbon capture and storage and things that are pushing the needle from an innovation standpoint, which is certainly important. But I think there's a big gap in helping tap into solutions we already have available to us to be able to reduce in the near term and buy ourselves time for some of those longer term investments to really pay off. And I'm personally extremely motivated by grassroots change, by change that's driven by people. I think it's really important for a solution like climate change, to a problem like climate change, that really is a collective action problem.
Okay, so when you're talking about the app and individual action around climate change, people sometimes have doubts. They underestimate the impact of individual action. So what are some of the talking points that you bring up to say, well, that's not true?
One of the most important facts I learned is that over 60% of global emissions are directly created or influenced by consumers. They directly come from consumer products that we are responsible for buying. Certainly, I think it's important to distinguish. We have power. That doesn't mean it's our fault. We certainly are not the ones who've made the decisions over the last 50, 100 years that have gotten us to this place. But given the state of the world right now, we do have power that we need to tap into as soon as possible to accelerate the shift to a low carbon future. So the fact that 60% of global emissions are impacted directly by consumers is a huge opportunity to take action into our own hands. I think it's also interesting to think about areas where consumers have already led the shift. So plant-based eating is a really great example. Americans have eaten 19% less meat over the last decade, and that's simply because consumer tastes and preferences are changing relatively quickly. There was no government mandate to eat less meat. Companies certainly weren't innovating without consumer demand in that area. So that's one area we've made a lot of progress in, and we can continue to make progress in. And then there's other examples for shifting to cleaner sources of home energy, transportation, et cetera.
All right, just a comment from Mike saying yes to plant-based eating. So people got some fans to that approach. Are there, and you mentioned sort of like, are there other case studies that you looked to when you were developing the app and this approach that are like successful examples of collective action? And I was trying to come up with some in my head. And, recycling, there's been a lot of into recycling, but it might not be as, widespread as we want, but are there other areas that you sort of look toward as models?
Well, I think there are certainly other parallels. Divestment movements are examples of how people and companies, or boycott movements are examples of how people and companies have used their buying power as a way to influence corporate decision making. I also think about maybe less directly a parallel, but apps and products like Fitbit, Headspace, Strava, who have created the space of sort of aspirational living for consumers, helping us align the way we live with the world we want to live in, and build a practice around an ideal. So it should be just as easy to build our climate practice and live in a way that sustains the earth as it is to start a meditation practice or to get in shape. So I think there's a few other parallels in other spaces.
Well, and let's talk about the app a bit. You mentioned a little bit about it, but could you, I guess, maybe describe some more of the features? And so I'm assuming it's available on Android and iPhone, but you download this app. What are people seeing?
It's available on Android and iPhone in the US. When you open up the app, you'll first be able to answer a few questions to get an initial estimate of your carbon footprint, which might look familiar to people who've used a carbon footprint calculator before. We try to keep it relatively streamlined. And if you're interested, you can connect your credit or debit cards to see a more real-time and granular picture of your carbon footprint based on what you personally spend money on. So if you see that over the last month, my biggest purchases have been groceries and clothing, and how much money I spent on those categories, Jaro will give you an estimate of your carbon footprint based on those transactions. We also give you paths to action. So you can both see the breakdown of your carbon footprint by category and over time. You can also see how well you're doing versus what you would need to reduce to meet the Paris climate goals. So we show everyone about a 7 to 8% reduction year on year is what we would need to meet the Paris climate goals and stay on track for 1.5 degrees warming. So you can sort of see what's my budget, what's my carbon budget, and am I on track to be meeting my goal? And then you can take action either through behavior change or carbon offsets. So you can join a challenge. For instance, we're launching our first plant-based eating challenge in September, where you can say this is an action I want to try, and you can track your progress. You can see the trees you earn, which directly translate into kgs of CO2 saved from that particular behavior change. Or for things that you feel you can't reduce, you could purchase offsets for flights or for a subscription. And then something we're working on is building out more content and learning into the app so we can connect some of those actions with facts and data and stories around those actions.
So is there a sweet spot? I imagine as they kind of figure out their own personal behaviors and patterns that do you guys really need 3, 4, 5 months of like behavior before you start making recommendations? Or I mean, how does that all factor in?
We actually start by pulling in, if you connect a card, we start by pulling in your previous 30 days of transactions before you get into the app. So we're able to give you an estimated baseline, sort of a natural experiment versus where you started before you knew your carbon footprint, and then use that to suggest your goal.
So, and it's April. I mean, that hasn't been that long, but are you seeing any patterns of people are interested in changing their personal behavior versus like, oh, the offset, I'm going to go the offset way? What are you kind of seeing from your users?
It's been super interesting. Actually, I wasn't sure which would be more popular. I personally am a really big fan of looking for more systematic ways we can change our habits. And so I'm a big fan of behavior change. I think offsets are important, especially because we'll never be able to get to zero, no matter how hard we try. And they're a way for people to express demand for additional emissions reduction, though there's a lot of problems with offsets. They're not perfect. But actually, something like 40% of people are committing to a behavior change within one of their first uses of the app, and something like 5% of people are buying offsets. So it's interesting. I think it's a subset of people who are really committed, who want to draw down their emissions a level further than they can, are going for the offset option. But a lot more people are open to and interested in what are ways in my own life that I can make longer term changes to reduce my carbon footprint.
All right, and so the recommendations that you do make is based on so the information that they provide, but sometimes you kind of get in a rut, and I'm sure the recommendations you come up with are based on those behaviors, but do you give other ideas that are completely out of left field just because they might want to bring some new thinking into what they do? Is that part of it?
We would love to do that, or it's definitely something we're working on. I think there's a lot of potential to try to, especially with content, try to give people new ideas of what they could be doing. We also are starting to build out a social part of the platform, because obviously Jaro is not going to have all the answers, but people can provide each other ideas in a way that we couldn't. So you can follow friends in the app and you can join groups. And soon, hopefully, we'll start building that out so people can interact with and learn from others in the community.
All right. So your own personal use of it, and this might not be the best case study, but like, do you feel like there's behavioral change that has occurred because you're looking at it and you're like, you know what, I got to do that differently?
Definitely. I mean, I think tracking my meat consumption was the first thing I really did, and that's why I'm excited that we're launching that in September. It asks you first to count how many meals a week do you usually eat that include red meat, white meat or fish, or dairy and eggs as sort of your initial baseline. And just to even just that step of acknowledging how much you ate, I was pretty surprised. I thought I probably eat meat, a minority of my meals. But once I started counting, I realized I was eating it most of the time without really thinking about it. And reducing it wasn't so difficult. Maybe I wouldn't be vegan, or maybe I eat one meat meal a week now after starting to track that. But by cutting down from where I was before, 12 meat meals a week, to now one meat meal a week, that's a difference of about 2.5 tons a year of carbon, which is like taking half a car off the road or planting 100 trees, or the carbon that 100 trees absorb in a year. So that's one big thing that just tracking allowed me to see. Also, for my spending habits, it's helpful for me to see before what I was spending on clothes versus now what I spend on clothes is a lot less. I've saved a lot of money by buying less, and starting to switch to secondhand. And just looking at even like the volume of digital transactions, like Amazon transactions, has been something that I've personally tried to cut down on. And being able to see it in your financial record is an added bonus, because I also get to see how much money I save along the way.
So obviously the whole app aspect's got me thinking too, is that, a successful user of your app, they could almost graduate from not using your app. Not that that's what you want, but then others, it's like long term. All right, they have sort of small incremental gains. But I mean, you could see a situation where, all right, you know what? I have reduced things down to the bone. Thanks a lot. You guys were awesome. And so I imagine you're gonna have all those kind of different kind of users.
Yeah, definitely. There could be people who reduce their footprint a certain amount and then decide, that's it, I'm good.
I did it.
I did it. But what we're really finding is that the more you learn about climate change, the more difficult it is to ignore it. I don't know if this has been true for you, but it's certainly been true for me. The more I learn and the more I think about other ways I want to try to take action. So maybe if I've already kind of done the low hanging fruit in my behavior change, then I start thinking about, where do I want to invest money in offsets? Then I start thinking about, maybe there's more difficult things in my life I'm willing to do, and maybe have a discussion with my partner or my family about larger changes we're going to make to our lifestyle as a result. Then maybe I start thinking about my career, my workplace. How am I going to influence my company as an employee? Maybe I want to get all of the employees at our company doing this together and the company paying for our offsets. Or maybe I want to start thinking about getting politically engaged and doing work in my community to make this a bigger deal. And I think there's a lot of different paths we'd love to be able to help people connect with whatever the right thing is for them at their stage of their climate journey.
Oh, yes, I got a question from Mike. What are some examples of really effective behavior changes that we might not already know about, that you know of, that can help people get started?
Some of the big ones that most people know about are probably around plant-based diets and flying less. People often that I talk to actually don't realize how big flying less is, though. That's certainly one that, a month of eating plant-based is not going to be anywhere near what the carbon you save from just skipping a single round trip flight. So thanks, COVID, for that. Some of the ones that are a little bit more unusual: air drying your clothes is a big one. Heating and cooling in our apartments and our houses is one of the biggest sources of energy use. So trying to cut down on dryer usage and air drying your clothes, or washing your clothes with cold water together, that action can be relatively impactful. There's certainly a lot of ways that we can look at using clean energy at home for people who live in houses and for whom solar is an option. That's always a great idea to think about. But really, for anyone who has a utility company anywhere in the country, it's possible to switch to clean energy. And often it's about the same cost to do that as to get energy from dirty sources. So that's a really important action. There's things like changing a heat pump from gas to electric, which can be really effective, or carpooling and driving less. Even carpooling to work one day a week, if we were in a world in which we carpooled or drove to work, is a really impactful action. Cutting down on car trips can be really effective. Walking and biking more is also great for our health. And then there's more controversial ones, which we don't suggest in the app, but like not having children is a really unusual one that a lot of climate scientists talk about. Are we in a world in which millennials and Gen Z will be able to have children and Earth will be able to sustain our futures? Not necessarily clear, but there's the one out of left field that is one that people are discussing, at least as something people need to think about. We want to create a thriving future for people on Earth. We want to make it worth living for. So these are all the things that we can think about.
What I guess your engineers are going to have to factor in, if you did start in April, the baseline for air travel is going to be so low. And so starting next year, whatever, when we start going, it's this huge bump for everyone in their app. And so I don't know, you get some algorithm that sort of says, well, this was the COVID, collapse there, because they'll be like, oh, I just upped everything.
I know. We've been thinking about, I feel like this is part of a um, larger consideration in the app of how do we account for things like life events or world events, whether that's COVID or that's someone's moving to a different country, having a child. Those are all really big life events that dramatically change your carbon footprint. Getting a pet. So how do we account for that kind of stuff is something that our engineering team is thinking about.
All right, so what are you guys working on next? I mean, I'm sure with an app, you're always thinking about features, and you've alluded to some here. But so next 6 months, next year, what are you hoping to do with Jaro?
Say three big things on our minds for the next few months. One I mentioned around challenges is how do we make the app engaging and fun? How do we make it worth coming back to? There's some things that you can learn in your first interaction, but then there's other things that you might need support on over time, or you might want to connect with friends in over time. So how do we really build engagement into the product in a fun way? I think that's something climate has not done well in general, is keeping people engaged and positive about the future. The second big thing is social. So making it easier for people to connect with others, making groups a more prominent feature, and really we're starting to show the collective impact that people are having together on the app, which is obviously the most important thing. And really showing that to users of how they're part of something bigger than themselves, and together as a community, what can we influence, not only through our actions, but through our intention. And then the third thing is content and learning. I think there's a lot of space for more action-oriented climate content. How do we get to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions in the next decade? What's going to get us there? Maybe featuring content from some of our favorite sources, how we stay up to date on the climate crisis, and helping contributors from the community share their knowledge with others. So those are sort of the three big things on our mind for the next 6 months as we develop the product. And then also starting to think about other markets. Right now, we're focused on the US, but climate change is a global problem, and it's really important to us to start trying to build a global community.
All right, so we're almost at the end of the episode, but I had another question for Mike. Do you have any participation or user surveys you are conducting with the app right now that early adopters of the app could participate in?
Great point. Certainly, we have a sign up link on our website right now for Sustainable September, which is our plant-based eating challenge. We're going to be putting out content and asking users questions as part of that first month of challenges testing. So that's a great way for people who want to get engaged to share their feedback and input with us on where we should be going. We also are working on a new challenges beta tester sort of community. So if anyone's interested in joining our beta testing community, they could email us at info@joro.tech if they're really passionate about thinking about how we could make the product better. And I think those are two of the biggest things we're putting out there into the world right now.
Cool. Well, I need to download the app. I haven't downloaded it yet and start using it and such. I'd be curious like how it unfolds over 6 months. It's very exciting what you're doing here.
Thank you.
And well, thank you for coming on. And we certainly, this is the first episode. Hopefully, we'll have you back on, and maybe there's a point where you can come on. You can talk about user responses and all those kind of things. There are all sorts of conversations we'd love to encourage to have with you here on Simpatico.
We would love that, definitely. And curious to see what happens as the world uh, gets better in different ways. We've definitely seen a reduction in users' carbon footprints since shutdown. On average, something like 15 to 20%
Wow.
reduction. For me, over the last few months, it's been more like 40 to 50%. And really curious to see how those trends change and to keep users engaged and helping us think about how to adapt as the world adapts.
Very cool. So we're going to close out this episode. I want you to stick around. We're going to go into just chatting for a few minutes, but thanks for again for coming on and for what you're doing.
Thanks.
All right, just one.